Panettone is an Italian Christmas cake that is in stores everywhere at Christmas time. It is also notoriously difficult to make from scratch, so let's try it. So I did a lot of research into looking into traditional panettone and trying to find traditional recipes, but it turns out panettone is kind of like chocolate chip cookies in that everyone and their grandmother has their own recipe for it, and each recipe is slightly different. So I didn't really find any traditional recipes, but I found ones that looked good, and so I just picked a couple of those. So the first recipe I tried was pretty standard. You mix the first set of ingredients together and you let it rise. Though it was kind of weird because it asked me to mix these ingredients together for 20 to 25 minutes, which on a mixer seems really excessive, and I don't know if it's supposed to be on a mixer or by hand because the recipe didn't say, but I went ahead and just did it for 25 minutes on my mixer because, you know, it can't hurt anything except my mixer. So technically this dough was supposed to get like all smooth and pretty, but it was so stiff that it really wasn't doing that. But since it'll be mixed more, I figured I would just leave it and it would be fine. Probably. So when it's done mixing, you take the dough and form it into a little ball and put it in a greased bowl and then let it sit and rise to triple in volume. That was something else that was very common between all of the panettone recipes, was the first rising has to triple in volume, not double like normal bread. Triple. This recipe said to put it in a warm place for about 10 hours. It's winter, so nothing's warm, so I figured it would just take a little bit longer than 10 hours, but eventually it got there. I don't know if it was technically tripled. It wasn't rising very much. I wasn't sure if that was just because it was cold or because I screwed it up somehow, but it was quite a bit bigger, so I went with it. So for the second mixing, you take your original rise plus flour, vanilla, egg yolks, and honey. And then technically this recipe also called for half a cup of sugar, which was in the ingredient list, but then not in the written recipe, so I didn't know where to add it or if I was even supposed to add it. So I went ahead and just added it. And then you mix that for about half an hour. Again, seemed like a long time, was pretty rough on my mixer. That's pretty rough. But it made it through. Then you add in some more melted butter and mix it until it becomes shiny and dry. But this dough was so crazy stiff, I wasn't sure if it was gonna work at all. Okay, so the butter gets all mixed in. Then I added some orange and lemon zest, because that was a pretty common theme. A lot of the recipes call for the candied orange or lemon peel, but I didn't have it, I couldn't find it, and I didn't want to spend the time to make it, so zest worked. By this point in the day, the sun was going down, so please excuse the orange mood lighting that we're gonna have for a little bit. Now it does say to mix in the raisins at the end, but this dough was so stiff I was afraid it was just going to crush the raisins, so I just did it by hand instead. I did go to a specialty food store and got 2 panettone molds. So you split the dough, make it into 2 little balls, and then put it into the panettone molds to do the final rise. Now it says to do the final rise in a warm, humid spot. Again, almost winter, everything's cold and dry, so I just went ahead and let them rise overnight. And rise they did. I was worried honestly that they weren't even gonna work, but they looked pretty good in the morning. So then you cut an X in the top. The recipes again varied on what you're supposed to do. If you put egg wash on it, if you put butter on it, if you just put butter in the middle of the X. I decided to coat the whole thing with butter and then put pearl sugar on top, which the recipe recommended, since I happen to have pearl sugar that I bought on a whim one day and hadn't used since. I don't even remember when I bought it. I know it looks like pretzel salt. No, it's little bits of sugar, I promise. And here it is done! And you might notice that it's really dark. And you see here, taking the paper off. Oh dear, yeah, it's done. It's almost charcoal, that's fine. It did start to smell like it was burning, maybe about 15-20 minutes into the baking, and I noticed it's because I had it sitting up too high in the oven, so it was too close to the element, so the top was getting burned, so I just lowered the whole thing and put foil on top to keep it from burning anymore. Or so I thought. Later on, while it was still cooking, still smelled like burning, but I checked under the foil and it wasn't getting any darker, so I thought, it's fine, it's just the top. It still smells like it's burning, but it's fine. I had no idea the parts inside the paper were getting burned because I couldn't see through the paper. Yep. Okay, so that was a 3-day process. I burned the crap out of it. That sucks. But I wanted to at least taste it and see if it tasted like panettone. And it was pretty good. It did taste like it. It was just really dry because I really overcooked it. But otherwise, I thought, okay, I burned these, but this is a pretty good starting place for a bread that's supposed to be hard to cook that I've never made before in my life. Now, I honestly didn't want to try this recipe again since the dough was so stiff and my mixer was really starting to smell kind of hot. I didn't want to risk burning up my mixer, so I got one of the other recipes I was looking at. It was still pretty early in the morning, so I thought, okay, I'll start this second recipe, let it rise overnight, try baking panettone again tomorrow. So this second recipe, pretty similar. I noticed that this one had a lot of sugar in the first mixing, and I thought that was kind of odd, but I double checked the recipe, and I thought, okay, well, I'm sure this blogger knows what they're doing. And then I got this like sticky mess that was kind of like sugar cookie dough. I mean, it was so sticky. I thought, okay, I must have screwed it up. I must have weighed something wrong. I measured something wrong. Okay, throw this away, reweigh it, remeasure it, try a second time. Okay, round 2. It's actually kind of looking better. It's a little bit drier, a little bit concerned that it's too dry, but let the mixer go, do its thing for a while. It was very crumbly and messy, but since the previous attempt turned out so squishy and sticky, I didn't want to add any extra water yet, just in case this would come together. And it was starting to. Okay, looking pretty good, looking much better than the first time. Okay, now it's looking a lot like the first batch again. Okay, so I'll try adding just a little bit of flour, and we'll see if it wants to come together. No, okay, let's try adding just a little bit more flour. Mixing, starting to come together, and okay, we're back to sugar cookie dough. It just does not want to stick to the hook at all. Okay, so after it comes together, which it didn't, but after it comes together, you're supposed to add softened butter. So I thought, okay, maybe I can cheat and add the softened butter just a little bit early. Maybe it'll help it glide in the bowl more easily and it'll stick together a little bit better instead of just being sticky. So I added the butter. In the beginning, it looks pretty good. Okay, and then we end up with soup again. So this recipe didn't work at all. I don't know why. I don't know if it was me. I don't know if it's the recipe. I don't know if it's written wrong. I don't know if I made it wrong. I have no idea. I actually was on the verge of giving up, but that night, I did some more research, found another recipe from Bruno Albouze, who's one of my favorite chefs on YouTube, and I decided to make his. I've made some of his other recipes. They've never failed me. Hopefully this one will turn out good too. So Bruno's recipe starts with a starter. How appropriate, which is just flour, salt, water, and yeast. Okay, so once the starter's mixed, form it into a ball, put it into a greased plastic bowl, and then let it rise until it's very puffy, which says it'll take about 3 hours. Then you punch it down, shape it into a ball again, and then put it in the fridge for at least 10 hours. So far, this was working out really well. Things were looking up. So the next day, we start by taking more yeast and adding it with more milk and kind of making a paste out of it, which takes about 5 or 10 minutes. Now we mix together flour, vanilla, salt, and sugar. Now he likes to use vanilla beans in his recipes, and I happen to have vanilla beans, so I'm going to use them, but you could easily use vanilla extract instead, which he actually puts in the recipe. And after that's all mixed together, we add the yeast paste, some cold milk, and the egg yolks. Mix it for the time it says in the recipe, which I followed exactly. Then we scrape down the sides and then knead it for another 10 minutes. Once in a while stopping to scrape down the sides of the bowl, because at this point it's really sticky and it really wants to stick to the sides. Okay, things are going well so far. It's looking like it's supposed to. My mixer's smelling a little bit hot, but I'm going with it. It's fine, we'll be fine. Mix it for the amount of time it says on the recipe, adding the starter in the middle. Okay, and after the 10 minutes are up, then we add softened butter. And I started just squishing it in by hand because it just helps it mix in a little bit better. And then we let that go for another 10 minutes. Now, while all of this is happening and you're waiting for your mixer to do its thing, I wanted to sort of reconstitute the raisins I was using just a little bit. So I had them in a bowl and then I soaked them with just hot water. Really, this recipe calls for a marinated fruit mixture, but I didn't have some of the stuff and I didn't want to marinate overnight, and I don't drink, so I don't have any rum. So I just did raisins and hot water to make them a little bit more plump. Okay, so this dough was looking so good and it was so squishy and beautiful. And once the butter was done, it was still squishy and beautiful. So when it said to add the raisins in, I went ahead and did it because I knew it wouldn't crush them. It was still having a hard time mixing, I think just because my bowl is a little bit small for this amount of stuff. I don't know, whatever. I just took it off the mixer and finished mixing the raisins in by hand. And then we take the finished dough, put it into a greased bowl, and then this recipe actually says to just let it rise for a few hours. So I thought, cool, I'll do that, and I can finish the whole thing today. Pause. So what happened next happened so quickly and sporadically that I didn't actually have time to get my camera out and film all the little bits and pieces. So I was going to finish the whole panettone in one day, but then my older sister said, hey, do you want to go see Star Wars? And I was like, yes. So I went and did that instead. In the recipe, Bruno says you can put the dough in the fridge and then just let it proof overnight. So I thought, perfect, I'll do that. So I threw it in the fridge, and then after a couple hours, it was time to go to the movies, but I wanted to check on it, and it had already tripled in size, which wasn't what I was expecting, but I thought, okay, it hasn't been in there for very long, so maybe it's not cold enough yet to slow the yeast down. So I punched it down, put it back in the fridge, went to the movie, got home, checked on it, and it had already tripled again. So I thought, well crap, okay, I can't leave this dough alone or it's gonna take over my fridge. So I wasn't planning on finishing this late at night, but that's what I had to do. Okay, so totally unprepared to even do this at that point, and I didn't really have anything set up yet. I had to really rush to get it together. I bought little paper tulip cups at the grocery store so I could make little panettone. Since the big ones burned the first time, I thought, okay, I can make small ones. I didn't have any more panettone wrappers, so I used a small cake pan and put parchment paper on the bottom and then made a ring of parchment paper and put that around the edge. Okay, same shape. And then I wasn't even sure how much dough this was gonna be, but it looked like a lot, so I had 2 aluminum loaf pans that were just sitting in my cupboard, and I used those too. And I figured out of all of this stuff, something would end up working out. And so I started dividing the dough. I didn't have measurements or weights or anything for how big it was supposed to be. I was going off of previous experience making brioche. I didn't know if it was gonna rise out of the containers. I didn't know if I even had enough dough to fill all these containers. I had limited time to work with how active this dough was, and I just went for it. And it actually ended up pretty perfect. Split up all the little ones, made the main panettone, the big one, and then just split the rest of the dough up into the 2 loaves, which seemed like a little bit much for the loaves, but it worked out just fine. And then I let those sit for their final rise. Now they were taking a long time to rise just sitting on the counter, and I didn't really want to be baking at 1 o'clock in the morning. So pro tip, if you need to proof bread, turn on your oven for just a little bit of time. Don't let it get higher than 100 degrees. Turn it off and then put your bread in the oven to proof. It'll proof way faster. So I did that. And so far, they still look beautiful. I was really worried since they had risen so much in the fridge that they weren't gonna rise this time, but they turned out fine. Now I really loved the pearl sugar from the first batch, but it didn't really stick very well. So for these ones, I went ahead and did an egg wash, which I don't think is traditional, but I really like how it looks, and it's my panettone, I can do what I want. So I did an egg wash and then put pearl sugar on top. And I decided to bake the little panettones first. I wanted to bake them for way less time. I figured these would be a good starter sort of test to see how the big ones were gonna turn out. And look at them. Oh, they're so cute. Oh, they turned out so perfect, or at least perfect looking. I couldn't tell at this point what the insides were like, but the outside looked really good. So I went ahead with the big ones. And the big ones, oh, they turned out so good. They actually started to get a little bit dark, like the very first panettone recipe did. So I covered them with foil, same thing, and they looked beautiful. Again, not sure what the insides are like, but the outsides are looking really good. By this point, it was midnight, so I let them cool overnight and went to bed. And the next day, they still look really good. The only question now is, what did they look like inside? So I started with a small one, and after taking the paper off, it looked really good. The bottoms were a little bit dark, but not quite to the point of being burned, so I was really happy with it. Breaking it open, I noticed there wasn't very much fruit. I did leave out the candied peels, so that's missing. So if I made this again, I would add some more raisins, just to help fill in the space a little bit so there's more fruit dispersed throughout the dough, but it looked really good. And after giving it a taste, it tasted awesome. I was so happy with how these little ones turned out. So the next test were the big ones. I didn't want to test the full-size panettone yet because I was still really nervous about it and I wanted to save it till last, so I decided to look at one of the loaves first. The top looked really good, but I was a little concerned about the inside because it was so big and I had to bake it so much longer. And interestingly enough, the sides look really nice, but the bottom is burned. Now I was afraid of the loaves overflowing in the oven because I wasn't sure how they were gonna bake, so I had them on a cookie sheet. I think that's the reason they burned, is the cookie sheet got hot, the foil got hot, and then it made the bottom too hot for the bread, so the bottom burned. I was okay with that, but now it was time to look at the big panettone. First thing I noticed, the bottom is really dark. Oh, it's completely black. Okay, well, must be a similar problem because it was in a cake pan on a cookie sheet. I think the metal is just too hot for it, which maybe is part of the reason that it's baked in paper molds and not in pans. And taking the paper off, yep, the entire part where it was touching the cake pan is burned on the outside. So that's interesting. I didn't think that would happen, but now I know for the future. Okay, so let's look at the inside and see if it burned into the panettone. Nope. Looks good. Good amount of raisins, nice color, very fluffy, tasted really good. I was so relieved and I was so happy that this one actually came out, with the exception of it being burned, but I knew how to fix it. If I had just used a real panettone mold, I think it would have been fine. But I was so happy that, especially after trying to make this for like a week, finally got one that worked. Bruno, man, your recipes, they never fail. So yeah, I'm gonna say that this is a pretty difficult bread to make, just like the recipes warned me. I always love a challenge. I thought it was fun. It was frustrating at one point, but still fun. And in the end, I found a recipe that worked. If you've made panettone before and you have a favorite recipe, let me know in the comments below. Link it, and maybe I can try and make it next year. If you don't want to make a panettone, the ones that they sell in boxes at the stores are actually really pretty good. So, you know, just get one of those. All right, y'all, thanks for watching. Subscribe for more, and I'll see you next time.